Okay, well, we got Abraham and Ishmael and all the men circumcised last week, and then immediately we go into chapter 18. And after that, it says, the last verse, and all the men of his house, slaves born in the house, and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. Next verse, the Lord appeared to Abraham by the oaks of Mamre, and he sat at the entrance of his tent in the heat of the day. He looked up and saw 3 men standing near him. When he saw them, he ran from the tent entrance to meet them and bowed down to the ground. He said, "My Lord," or "my lords," or "sirs," depending on the different translations. And the word is Adonai, which is the word for Lord, which could mean the Lord, but with the Hebrew context is so important for meaning, but a lot of times it's meant to have double and triple meanings rather than real precise. So anyway, this seems to be that way, but most translations say "my Lord" or "sirs." "If I find favor with you, do not pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Let me bring a little bread, that you may refresh yourselves, and after that you may pass on, since you have come to your servant." So they said, rather than one of them speaking, they said, "Do as you have said." And Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Make ready quickly 3 measures of choice flour," not your standard average flour, but choice flour. "Knead it and make cakes." Abraham ran to the herd and took a calf, tender and good, and gave it to the servant, who hastened to prepare it. And then he took curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared, and he set it before them. And he stood by them under the tent while they ate. They said to him, "Where is your wife Sarah?" You might wonder how they know her name. And he said, "There, in the tent." And then one said, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent entrance behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. How many times are they going to tell us that? It just over and over and over again. "And it ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I have grown old, and my husband is old, shall I have pleasure?" And the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, Shall I indeed bear it?" And she says one thing here, and now he's quoting her supposedly, but those aren't the same words. Anyway, "Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old? Is anything too wonderful for the Lord?" the person asks. And then at a set time, "I will return to you in due season, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I did not laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "Oh yes, you did laugh." And then the men set out from there, and they looked toward Sodom. And Abraham went with them to set them on their way. And the reason he goes with them is just that's part of the hospitality, and sort of like showing people to the door when they've visited your home. You just don't stay seated and they get up and they let themselves out. You graciously go to the door with them, and and then sometimes you'll go outside with them and walk with them, go to the car, and you go with them a lot, all the way, just to be gracious. And so anyway, and the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? seeing that Abraham shall become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him? No, for I have chosen him, that he may charge his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord may bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. And then the Lord said, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, how very grave their sin, and I must go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know. We'll pick up on that a little later, but right now we will go back and look at the beginning of chapter 18 and follow the questions and issues that it raises. I think it shrunk again, didn't it? There. Now, my little notebook isn't that heavy, so maybe it'll stay up here. The setting here, Abraham the tent dweller, is again a herdsman at the edge of city life on the one hand, and in the wild and hostile wilderness on the other hand. By the oaks of Mamre, this is a place where there is a shrine. It's a religious gathering place, and so there's a lot of settlement around it. But being a herder, he can't be right in the town, but has tents and is on the edge of town. Now, from this one, we have the image of a more modest kind of Abraham, in that if he was the warrior chieftain that we had earlier, wherever his tent would have been, he probably would have been surrounded by all these other tents, and then that warrior chief is really a little more of a settled environment. His wouldn't have been, this gives the image of kind of one tent just right out there, and so the three strangers are right there at his tent. They're not intercepted and have to wander through town in order to find him, but they're right there. So we have that image of Abraham coming back into this story, and this is mostly Yahwist author writing that. But now the big theme in this is hospitality and the importance of hospitality in their culture. Now, for one, the traveler, to survive, hospitality is necessary because conditions are very tough in these days, and they don't have convenience stores and hotels and whatnot. And so anybody could be in the need of hospitality, and so it's the enlightened self-interest for the culture, everybody to be hospitable and welcoming and helpful. On the other hand, the one at the oasis or the camp who does have resources, if you do not show gracious and generous hospitality to strangers who come by, they may decide to attack you and kill you for the resources you have, or just steal them from you. So it's advantageous for everybody to have this virtue of hospitality and have it work well within that kind of a culture and setting. It was helpful to everybody to have this hospitality in operation. So, as they say, hospitality in the Bedouin or nomadic, semi-nomadic culture is a very high value. And so what Abraham offers, we get, it's about a bushel of wheat, and it's the best flour that's provided. Not I don't know what, I forget. There were some other places, I guess barley loaves or some other kind that are not the best. They're kind of rough and coarse, but this is the best flour that he tells him to make the bread for the meal, and he goes and gets a really fine calf to be slaughtered in order to prepare the feast. Now, this account is showing Abraham possessing this great virtue of hospitality. He does so immediately. It's an automatic reaction. It's illustrating an inherent part of his nature and character. He didn't need to think about it. He didn't have to be coaxed to share things. He didn't have to be prodded. And so this is a real powerful illustration by the author to try to give the image of the virtues and goodness of Abraham here. However, the origin of the story seems to have come from a rather polytheistic source where gods visit human beings to check on them and to test them to see if they are righteous or wicked or not. And that theme carries on in that part where they visited Abraham, they've seen his great virtue of hospitality. Now they're going to go down and check on Sodom and Gomorrah to find out what kind of hospitality or virtues they have, because, as it says, there are stories about their wickedness. So we're going to have to go check it out and test them to see if what the truth is. So anyway, but the origin comes from, in the culture, there were a lot of stories like this. One, and it's quotes from Odysseus, or the Odyssey, I and the gods in guise of strangers from afar put on all manner of shapes and visit cities, beholding the violence and the righteousness of men. And that's a direct quote from the Odyssey, chapter 17, verses 485 and 487 in one particular translation. And then there's a Greek saga about the visit of three gods, Zeus and Poseidon and Hermes, and then a similar where they changed the gods to the Roman gods, who visit a childless Hyrieus in Boeotia, and after they have been served by him, then they help him acquire a son that he has long desired. And then in that story, that son happens to be Orion, who came to Earth after 10 months. So there are a lot of stories in the culture of gods or a god visiting human beings in order to test them and see what kind of character they possess. Now, in the ancient cultures, these kinds of stories are teaching tools to pass on the values and to teach the virtues of the culture. For example, we have, I can't remember exactly how the wording goes, but anyway, it's something to the effect, who knows whether the stranger or the visitor might not be angels or gods, or angels or gods or the God in disguise. And then a lot of us have these, you've read, I imagine, different little devotionals and things that draw upon the concept of the second coming. How are we going to know that if Jesus comes back, who he's going to be? And, how did the people who first experienced Jesus of Nazareth in that incarnation, a lot of them didn't recognize him. Well, if Jesus comes back with a second coming, what guise, what shape or form or personality or style might he be? And, how are you going to know? So, you better be good. You better watch out. You better not pout. Oh, that's something. That's a different story. But anyway, this whole theme, you don't know who this person is when you encounter a stranger. It might be God, or it might be Jesus coming back. So be careful how you treat people. So in our narrative, it begins with, "And the Lord appeared to him," Abraham, "by the oaks of Mamre." So again, this is a sacred holy place where visitations of the gods, of the spirits, were expected. It's a place where there's an altar, where there's a worship center, and Abraham sat at the door or by the flap of his tent in the heat of the day in that area. And so the Lord appeared, it says, and then immediately, next verse, 3 men stood in front of him. Now, the adaptation of the more ancient tradition of 3 men, but the introduction defines it as the Lord appears, creates some confusion here of who it is. Is it God with 2 attendants, or is it God just in the form of 3 people? But anyway, the Jewish scholar Rabbi Jonathan Sachs had an entirely different interpretation that I found rather interesting, in that this discussion of the God appeared, and then the 3 appears, and is it 2 or 3, and then 2 go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. I mean, it's real confusing if you try to keep track of who's who and what's what. But he says the relationship between the sections is far from clear. Do they represent 1 scene, 2 scenes, or 3 scenes? Is it one continuous story that we're to understand, or is it 3 separate stories that have been kind of woven together from different sources? And he says the most obvious possibility is 3. Each of the above sections is a separate event. First, God appears to Abraham, and then, as a rabbi explains, to visit the sick. Visit the sick? Well, we remember they were just, the verse before we started, the whole bunch of men had to be circumcised. Next verse, I mean, they haven't healed. They're not well yet. They're ailing. So after Abraham's circumcision, God comes to visit. It's a pastoral care visit. So, so then the visitors arrive with the news that Sarah will have a child. And then takes place a great dialogue about justice and the imminent punishment of the people of Sodom. That was the end where I stopped. But Maimonides suggests that there are only 2 scenes: the visit of the angels and the dialogue with God. The first verse does not describe an event at all. It is rather a chapter heading. It tells us that the events that follow are all a part of a prophetic revelation and divine human encounter. But the third possibility is that we have a single continuous scene. God appears to Abraham, but before God can speak, Abraham sees these 3 passers-by and asks God to wait while he serves the passers-by food. Only when they have departed, in verse 17, does he turn to God, and the conversation continues or begins and takes off. And that's an interesting thing. He says the interpretation of the chapter affects and hinges upon the way we translate the word Adonai, as I mentioned earlier. In Abraham's appeal, "Please, Adonai, Lord, if now I have found favor in your sight, do not pass by, I pray you, from your servant." So Adonai can be the reference to one of the names of God, and it can also mean my lords or sirs and so forth. But the same linguistic ambiguity appears in chapter 19 too, when 2 of Abraham's visitors, now described as angels, visit Lot in Sodom, and the 2 angels come from Sodom in the evening, and Lot by the gate. Anyway, it goes on. But it's he goes on to say that if it's this story that has a continuous theme where God appears to him, and then he said, then all of a sudden 3 strangers are there, and Abraham is saying to God, wait a minute, I need to do the obligations of hospitality for these 3 visitors, and so I'll get back to you. But Abraham, the father of monotheism, knew the paradoxical truth that to live the life of faith is to see the trace of God in the face of the stranger. It is easy to receive the divine presence when God appears as God, but what is difficult is to sense the divine presence when it comes disguised as 3 anonymous passers-by. And that was Abraham's greatness. He knew that serving God and offering hospitality to strangers were not 2 things, but one. By choosing the most radical of these 3 possible interpretations of Genesis 18, the sages allowed us to hear one of the most fundamental principles of the life of faith. We honor God by honoring His image in human beings, in the stranger. It's very subtle and very abstract, but yet a rather interesting way of looking at that text and trying to resolve this confusion. God appears, then 3. He bows down to the 3. Is he bowing down to God? And then that whole issue. But anyway, but the word Adonai can be used depending on the context, and it's meant to be ambiguous. This is one of the things about a lot of the Hebrew texts. They want it to be ambiguous, so we'll talk about it, and we'll try to process it and understand it and wrestle with it and ask questions. Well, what is it really, and how does it apply, and what does it mean? And if we just all hear it once and we think we all understand it, and then we just keep going on, we don't stop and live with that text and ask, well, what does it mean in itself, but then what does it mean for us, and how we have to live our life and respond to life situations. And this one's a real important one. Do we open our hearts and our minds and our doors and welcome the stranger, or do we put up fences and gates and guard dogs and alarms and security guards and patrol and have people who want to be vigilantes and pull out their guns and shoot innocent people because they think that they're dangerous, because they wear hoodies and such? I mean, it's an important question that we struggle with even today. But anyway, Abraham bows down, showing humility, and he calls them my lords or sirs, and then he begins to show great hospitality. Now, when there's a test, the test is supposed to show something. And this is one of the things teachers used to, the overachieving students who always want to get straight A's and make 100 and get all the extra points. The point that teachers would often make when students say, this is too hard, you didn't tell us this was going to be on the test and such. I heard this not all the time, but a few times, that if everyone gets 100, you're not truly tested. We have to test the limits of your knowledge. You can get a 99, but if you get them all right, we haven't truly tested the limits of your knowledge to show what you haven't learned yet and where you need to grow, because each test is supposed to be an educational tool, not just a pat on the back or a pat on the head and say you're great, you don't need to do any more. It's a teaching, a learning tool. So the test needs to reveal something about the one being tested. And so this test is meant to show something about this one being tested, and that's Abraham, and to show his virtue. But it's also another story, another case where they start talking about Sarah going to have a son. It's building the suspense. between the promise of a son and the eventual delivery, pun intended, of the promised son. And it's also, again, a test of Abraham's faith to hold out and keep believing, and Sarah to also hold out and keep believing. The suspense is being built. And then we have Sarah is brought into this story, and being earlier it was just Abraham, and now Sarah is getting more involved in the story. With each reiteration of the promise, it gets a little more precise, and we learn more. Again, we're hearing that they're growing older and older, making the fulfillment of the promise look harder and harder to be achieved, thereby increasing the suspense and then also creating a greater emphasis on the divine act of blessing when it will finally come. So, anyway, that's what's going on at different levels in the story. Now, the customs of the time were that once the meal is served, and this was interesting, it's served outside the tent. See, Sarah's inside the tent, but the men being served are outside the tent. And also, the men are dining alone. The women are not joining in with the meal. They're not included. So it is a normal setting for this to have Sarah in the tent where she can overhear the discussion but not be a part of that event. Now, the play on the name of the anticipated son Isaac, and we're told the interpretation is he laughs or has something to do with laughter. And Abraham has laughed about this when they first get the name being told them when in chapter 17, verse 17. And in this case, Sarah laughs about her having a son, but the name isn't given to us at that time. But the conversation about Sarah's laugh and her inner thoughts, or is she talking to herself, or is she talking out loud and they hear? But she is surprised by the Lord or one of the visitors or all of three in one voice, but they're saying to her that she laughed, and then she denies that she laughed. And logistically, one of the commentators says she probably, we would envision, she comes out of the tent and argues, "I did not laugh," rather than staying behind the tent, "No, I didn't laugh." So, anyway, we can imagine it however we want, but anyway, it's kind of interesting if we step aside a moment that we know that some people have a nervous laugh. We had a young couple that had joined the church at down in Ada when I was there, and he had just gotten out of the military. He had been a helicopter pilot, and they had come to Ada, and he was going to school at East Central. But they were working with our youth. But he was always chuckling, and a lot of times it was a very nervous laugh. I remember one time that there had been a problem and some confusion, and we had to talk about it and work it out. And it really wasn't a funny situation. It was a serious deal. But he kept kept chuckling, and I thought, this isn't funny. But I realized that he was a jovial, happy, winsome personality, and he was always smiling and chuckling, even in tense situations. And that was his defensive way of avoiding or ameliorating the conflict and tension, just trying to be happy and chuckle. But it was a very obvious in that setting where we were trying to work out a a problem situation, that it was just a nervous laugh. He wasn't laughing because anything was funny. It was just a nervous laugh. And so there are times when people might laugh as a way of overcoming stress or awkwardness. I know sometimes people will be embarrassed, and in order to not cry from the embarrassment, they will laugh, and everybody will laugh, and then they'll go off by themselves, and they'll cry because they were so embarrassed. But in the setting, it's a cover. It's a cover for something else. It's not really a laugh in that sense. So and then another case, sometimes kids will get in trouble, and an authority figure has confronted them, and they will laugh, and it will seem to the authority figure they're being disrespectful. They're not taking this seriously. Well, it's a defense. It's a nervousness coming out, and so in this laugh, and sometimes it's a fear reaction, like with a kid being caught. But Sarah's laugh could have been something like that. It was another kind of feeling, and the denial was a denial of the misunderstood meaning of the laugh, that it was somehow being disrespectful of the news or not appreciated, taking light of. But it may have been, an embarrassment about her age, that somehow promising her this gift when it would never happen was hurtful. And so the laugh might have been, meant to be coming from something like that, but not laughing it off or being disrespectful to the visitors and so forth. So the denial might have been more to do with how are you interpreting the laugh rather than I did or I didn't laugh. Anyway, mentioning all of that in the story is an injection of more suspense and letting the audience identify with Sarah and Abraham's feelings, getting ready for the miracle baby, building up to that. Now, and then it just throws in this one line, is anything too marvelous for God? Which, in my opinion, the commentators didn't pick up on it and say anything about it. But what I think it is just the story's coming along, they're telling the story, and we're dealing with the scene of the story, and then all of a sudden, this line is kind of to the audience who's listening to the story, for you to contemplate, is anything too marvelous for God? And then we continue with the story. So I think that's kind of a thing that the ancient Hebrew author is throwing out to the audience, and maybe pause and let's ponder that a minute or talk about that a minute. Is anything too marvelous for God to do for us? Anyway, so they're building the suspense between the promise and the fulfillment with all this repetition. Now, Rosenblatt and Horowitz, they're the psychologist lady, has some interesting contemporary reflections on this account, so far as she points out that hospitality, the most important gift to a guest, is not the food and the drink and the wonderful layout, but the most important gift to the guest is your time. Time. You will spend time. You will stop what you're doing and spend time with the guest. In our busy schedules nowadays, where both parents work outside the home, the kids have got all kinds of activities, we've got, my goodness, it's so many offerings for kids in sports and extracurricular activities. Now we've got the Olympics, and we see how all these people want their children to be Olympic stars, so they get them in all these athletic endeavors, or want them to be superstars and in all kinds of things. And so we're chasing around, taking them to all the practices and things. We've got scouting and gymnastics and school activities, and then if we have time, church. We got church activities. You know, unfortunately, there aren't too many scholarships offered for church, unless, as the bishop is saying, we've got some folks who want to go into the ministry, but just for the average kid, there's not, you know, like soccer or football or tennis or golf or dance or music or, you know, band or whatever different scholarships. And so it's kind of hard to set church as a high priority, but the point of which, families are so busy chasing around trying to meet all of these things. We're doing the fast food stuff. Don't have time to clean the house, so if anybody comes over, you got to schedule a whole week to get the house cleaned up and everything looking presentable, and then fix something. You know, you got to figure out a menu and then go shop because those things aren't in the cupboard, or when you look, oh my gosh, this is 10 years old, I can't use that. Anyway, so it's just hard to be open and welcoming like people used to be. In my early ministry, I'd visit folks and they'd have this expression, "Will y'all come by?" And it meant anytime the door's open, just stop by. I don't hear anybody saying that anymore. And we, you know, there are fears. I've read some things about ways to try to get us more sociable and welcoming and hospitable. That we ought to just, instead of gardens and fences, we need to put a bench in front of our house for if anybody's walking their dog or walking in the neighborhood, a place to sit down. And if they do, you can just come out and visit. Get to know your neighbors. That's one of the biggest preventions of crime in neighborhoods is neighbors getting acquainted, knowing one another. So you know who are strangers and who are not. So anyway, occasionally you have a lot of police cars showing up at one of the houses in the neighborhood, and a lot of times we don't know who those people are. We don't have any idea what they're up to. Why are the police there? You know, and on the one hand, it may be a domestic violence. On another hand, it may somebody had a stroke. Somebody had a heart attack. Somebody fell, broke a hip. And, you know, if we don't know folks, we don't know how to respond and help and care for them. Anyway, we have fears of home invasions, burglaries, privacy fences, gated communities, and neighborhoods for security. But we just don't drop by and visit like we used to. In my early ministry, like I said, people used to say, "Come on by," and I can remember one of my early churches. There was one family. They did say, "Come on by," and just drop by, and then just fixed an impromptu potluck and sat around and visited. Rosenblatt said there was one silver lining to the Great Depression, and that was so many people were out of work. They didn't have money, and so the best entertainment was people would sit around on the porch or on the kitchen, and they'd have coffee or tea, and they'd tell stories, and it didn't cost anything, and it was entertaining. Hearing the stories, getting to know people, and it built bonds of trust and understanding. When you know people, when you hear their story, you know where they came from, what their life has been like, you get an idea of who they are and what kind of a person this is. And if it's good, then you know, I can trust this person. They're a good person. As you hear them tell the stories and what meant something to them and how they feel about things, it establishes the bonds of love and affection and so forth. But anyway, she points out that our busy lives, where we're working harder, trying to earn more money in order to buy more things, thinking we're raising our standard of living, but the cost is the loss of hospitality that builds the relationships. And what most of us really want in life is to be loved, to be appreciated, to have friends. And so that's probably a good place to end today. We need to be... Oh, no it isn't. One more thing. We're having a big Reignite workshop here for the district, and one of our church's themes has been open hearts, open minds, open doors, to be more hospitable, because the need in our society, because of the busyness, people are hungering deeply for connection, to find a place to belong where they're welcome and where people will know them and they'll know folks, where they can care for and be cared for. And so this openness, this welcoming, this hospitality, this Old Testament theme going all the way back to Abraham is still important and still necessary. And so we need to, as a church, be more open and hospitable. And it reminds me, this welcoming and the feeding. In a lot of our discussions here at the